At the end of World War II, the European powers were in disarray, and the Soviet Union was bearing down on them, looking to possibly take the entire continent. For the first time in European history, it looked as if all of the powers of Europe would be forced under one banner, that of the Soviet Union. However, thanks to the efforts of the United States and the coalescing of European powers, this didn't happen. To ward off the Soviets, a new organization was created to counter their massive strength and huge military advantage on the ground. This organization still exists today, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. NATO stands still today as the Warden of the West, and their job is just as important, just against a different enemy today, and that is the Russian Federation. Today on World Made Simple, we're going to do a deep dive into NATO, and specifically why they're getting involved in the Ukraine war, and how if they leave the situation alone, it could spell disaster for the entire world. Hey guys, Bill here, and today we're going to talk about NATO. So, NATO is an organization that has been around for nearly 70 years at this point, formed after the end of World War II, like I said, to stop the Soviets. The Soviets might no longer exist today, but Russia certainly does, and with its invasion of Ukraine, there has been a lot of concerns about a wider war spreading. As the Warden of the West, it's NATO's duty to ensure this does not happen. And to prevent a wider war, NATO has to be involved in Ukraine. This video is going to discuss why and some of the implications of them both being involved and what could potentially happen if they're not involved. So, just like with our Russia video, we're going to go ahead and start off with the military side of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the sheer firepower it possesses. The contemporary of NATO, being the Russian Federation, is, for the lack of a better term, far behind on a lot of standards. While they do have a lot of up-to-date military equipment, their ability to scale and mass produce it has been limited at best. The West and NATO as a whole have not had this issue thanks to a large industrial base. The issue that they've had in these forces is getting the finance from them in the governments. Most of the European nations have been very hesitant to put money towards defense spending up until the last 2.5 years with the advent of the Ukraine war. Prior to that, the only nation really putting a lot of time and effort into military might was, of course, the United States of America, which still makes up nearly 75% of the entire organization in terms of its sheer force. Today, NATO represents the following. It represents the first and second largest air forces in the world, being the United States Air Force and the United States Navy Aviation Corps, as well as possessing the largest navy in the world, the United States Navy. So with this being said, why would NATO be concerned about Russia? Well, the issue now is the Ukraine war itself. The Ukraine war showed just how weak the conventional Russian forces are, and that in a one-to-one fight, they would likely crumble against the NATO intervention. Due to this fact, many analysts are extremely concerned that any war with Russia would not be conventional, simply because the Russians could not win a non-conventional war based on what we're seeing in Ukraine. This is a terrifying prospect, as that means that the only option left is nuclear. NATO doesn't want that to happen, and they know that if Putin is given the opportunity, he might be crazy enough to press that button. So, the question is, what can NATO do in this sense? Well, they can't get directly involved in Ukraine, but they can use their next best thing, their economy. NATO's most powerful asset isn't a ship, isn't a plane, isn't any weapon they have in their arsenal. It's their economic might. NATO has some of the most powerful economies on planet Earth in its membership. This includes France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and of course the United States of America. With some of the biggest players in the world economy within its ranks, NATO is able to use this power to great effect to ensure stability within Europe and abroad. This has been seen used heavily during the Russo-Ukrainian War. Russia has been put on the back foot as all of its oil and gas trade into Europe has all but ceased at this point. The majority of NATO nations have barred any trade with Russia on almost the entire front. And on top of that, the United States has started pulling back the use of the US dollar within the Russian economy. All of these different factors together make NATO's economic ability a potent weapon to be used to both prevent war and power its own economy. The United States is most famous for its military-industrial complex, but nations like Germany and Spain do have a decent industrial base in arms trade. So those can be called upon in times of war. And unlike Russia, which struggles to go ahead and produce its needs, because of the sheer number of countries involved in NATO, there is dozens of factories producing dozens of different pieces of equipment that can be converted into military means. So NATO is able to produce everything almost at the drop of a hat if it really needs to. All of this combined leads to a terrifying economic potential that really hasn't been tapped just yet. We've seen sanctions just kind of be the tip of the iceberg. And if Russia continues its advance, there could be a lot more to come. It's part of the reason China hasn't done anything towards Taiwan yet. After seeing what's happened to Russia, they can only imagine what the West would do during a Taiwanese invasion. But that's another video. So that's what's going on with the economy. We got to talk about the politics. Yeah, it's that part of the video. For all of NATO's benefits in terms of military and economic might, they fall short when it comes to politics. And the reason is, unlike China and Russia, which are formed from one governmental body, this is an organization formed from 30 governmental bodies, which means all of those organizations have to agree on how to use their militaries. The American Army has to agree with the French Army, has to agree with the German Army, has to agree with the British Army. There are some centralized command structures, but there still is disagreements on every single level. Additionally, you have the internal politics of those nations getting involved, most notably as of late, the US presidential election, as there has been a lot of talk of the direction of NATO within the United States recently, and as far back as 2016 with the Trump presidency. So this distracts NATO quite a bit from actually going ahead and carrying out its purpose. This even occurred during the Cold War. So the question now is, why is NATO in Ukraine, and are they going to stay in Ukraine? Because this is something that is going to determine not just the future of Ukraine and Russia, but of Europe and potentially the United States as a whole. That brings us back to the question of, why do we go to Ukraine? Why is America spending billions of dollars on Ukrainian weapons to keep the country both defended and also running as a whole? Well, the answer is because the world's getting a little bit feisty right now, for lack of a better term. You have the Israelis currently fighting just about everyone around them thanks to the Iranian proxies. You have Taiwan being very nervous about upcoming invasions by the Chinese as they claim to invade Taiwan by 2028. And finally, you have some conflicts popping off in places like Africa and South America that America's been trying to keep their eye on. The US Navy, Air Force, and Army are the best in the world, but there is only so much that they can do at once. The American armed forces are overstretched and currently both underfunded and undermanned. So with that, Europe now has to pick up the slack. The European militaries are not in fighting shape, save maybe the Poles and the French. This means that Europe has to wake up, and for the first time since World War II, have a fighting army capable of holding off the Russians on their own. While American support is expected, no one's really sure how much will actually be able to show up. So a war with Russia, if they're able to break through Ukraine, will be a massive and costly one. However, if we can keep it confined to Ukraine as a whole, there will be less casualties and less of a chance that Russia will intervene in another country, this time a NATO member such as Poland or any of the Baltic states. By keeping the Russians occupied in Ukraine, we hold off the war on a larger scale. NATO is willing to go ahead and send as many tanks, planes, guns, and bullets to the Ukrainians as they can if it means holding the Russians off from doing just this. Now, we already talked in my last video about Russia looking not so great right now. And it looks like this strategy that NATO's been using for the last 2.5 years is working. The question is if they can keep up the pressure and if Ukraine can continue to overperform in just about every aspect of the military. Time will ultimately tell. But while most of the world is looking at Ukraine, there's another potential conflict brewing. Not in Europe, but in Asia, specifically around the tiny little island known as Taiwan. We'll talk about that in our next video. For now, I've been Bill. Take it easy, everyone.